Hello to all the children of the world. And now I'm going to read The White Stag. This is a long book, so I'm going to read it in parts. Tonight is part 1. Okay, so get some snacks so you can enjoy the party. And here is the lemonade recipe. Lemonade is tasty. Also, I have some chocolate cupcakes. They can be cookies, they can be candies, they can be nuts, they could be fruits, and I have some lemon cookies. Those are just the snacks I love. This is a really good book, and not everybody has one. So, lemon cookies are very delicious. Okay, so this is a great book. The White Stag by Kate Seredy. Let me give you, here's the, see the sword and the eagle and the white stag? Dedicated to my mother. This book was written in 1937. It's an old book. Not long ago, I was leafing through a very modern book on Hungarian history. It was a typical 12th century book. Its pages an unending chain of facts. Facts, as refutable, logical, and as hard as the learned pens of learned historians could make them. Turning the pages, I felt as if I was walking in a typical 20th century city, a city laid out in measured blocks, glaring with the merciless white light of knowledge, its streets smooth, hard concrete facts. One could not stumble on streets like that, nor could one ever get lost. Every corner is so plainly marked with dates. My eyes fell on a paragraph. The early history of the Hungarian Magyar race is a matter of learned dispute. Their own traditions declare them to be descendants of the horde, which set in the 4th century the Huns, the Huns from Asia in the 4th century. The early history of the Hungarian Magyar race is a matter of learned dispute. Their own traditions declare them to be descendants of the horde, which set forth the Huns from Asia in the 4th century. Our present knowledge of the history and distribution of the Huns tends to disprove this theory. Well, I closed my eyes and then I saw an old garden, the great neglected park of old Hun Magyar legends, with moss creeping over the shadowy paths which twisted and turned, which led into hidden nooks where fantastic flowers grew around crumbling monuments of pagan gods. And I saw a little girl and her father tiptoeing along those winding paths, trailing the white stag, gazing breathlessly into the circle of birch trees, where the moon maidens danced on a carpet of flowers, standing awed and still before the tomb of Nimrod, mighty hunter before the Lord, and bowing their heads to the great crumbling stone altar of Hudar, powerful god of the Huns and Magyars. Often a path ended abruptly where a gigantic tree had crashed into the ground. its torn branches entwined in the creeping vines of centuries, but always the white stag appeared to show them a new path. It was beautiful, that park of legends, but the little girl who was I had never forgotten it. And now, 30 years later, I went back again to walk those winding paths, to listen to the scream of eagles, to pay homage to the race of brave men, men whose faith in their own destiny had led them to a land they still call their own. I went back to this time. I walked alone, and I took a ball of golden thread with me and unwound it as I trailed the white stag of legends with the great tomb of Nimrod to their green plains between the two rivers, the Hungarian plains. Those who want to hear the voice of the pagan gods in the wind and thunder, who want to see the fairies dance in the moonlight, who can believe that faith can move mountains, can follow the thread of the pages of this book. It is a fragile thread. It cannot bear the weight of facts and dates. There's a club. Remember this when we get further in the story. There's a horn and there's a bow and arrow. Snack time. Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Old Nimrod, mighty hunter before the Lord, leaned heavily against the stones of the sacrificial altar. There was sadness in his face, dejection in the stoop of his shoulder. The altar stones were cold with his touch. Many a sun had set since the tribe could pay tribute to Hadur, their powerful god. Sheep and cattle had died of a strange ailment. Game had deserted the forest and fields. There was nothing to offer on the altar. Once in a while he lifted his bowed head and looked around, his eyes searching the paths along the trees, his ears turning to catch the slightest noise. Nothing stirred. Silence hung heavily in the altar. Then he would bow his head again and remain motionless, lost in thought for a long time. The formidable snow-capped mountains around the altar place looked down on him in supreme indifference. They knew him as he knew them. He had hunted their thickly wooded slopes almost all of his life. He knew that beyond these mountains were others, peak upon peak, steep, cold, and impassable, an army of hostile mountains. Now he remembered the years of struggle and suffering while he had crossed them, leading his people, always following the sun from the east to the west. He remembered the years before that, the happy years when he was young and strong and heedless, the son of Cush, the great leader, the time when all people were brothers and spoke the same language, the years when in their vain pride people wanted to reach the heaven and build a Tower of Babel, the dreadful day of terror when their foolhardy daring they were punished. When for their foolhardy daring they were punished. When brothers ceased to understand brother. When terrific storm came and scattered them all over the earth like so many dry leaves in the wind. After the storm, he and a handful of people found themselves in a strange land, cold, rocky, and barren. For a long, long time they suffered from the cold and hunger, and then came the day when he heard the voice of God thunder and was given the power to understand it. He knew from then on what he must do. Somewhere there was a land, rich in game and green pastures, between two great rivers, plentiful in fish, surrounded by mountains, warmed by the sun, and sheltered from cold. And in this place he would be the home of his people. And if he could lead them wisely from east to west, always following the sun to the promised land, Many a time he thought that he had found the land, but each time Hadur spoke again, and he led his people further to the west. Now he was old, and soon his time would come when the younger leaders would be needed. The tribe had grown until their numbers were as many as those of the stars in the sky. They were strong and fearless, not a weakling among them. They would follow only the strongest and most fearless leaders, one who would bend their recklessness to his will and bow his head to no one but Hadur, the powerful god. Here he is at the altar with no offering. Not looking good. There's no animals. There were two such men in the tribe, two brothers, sons of old Nimrod, Hunar and Magyar. They could ride faster, shoot straighter, fight harder than any men. They could read the signs of the sun, moon, fire, and water, and they could lead the tribe towards the promised land, for they too understood the voice of Hadur when it spoke in the wind and the thunder. Old Nimrod lifted his head again to scan the darkening forest around him. He was waiting for his sons this evening, as he had waited for them every day at sunset since they rode away 7 moons ago to follow a stag, a miraculous white stag. It had appeared one day at sunset on the edge of the forest near the altar place. No one else had seen it, only Nimrod and his sons. No one else had seen it outlined against the western sky with the red setting sun shining through its majestic antlers, almost as if it was supporting the sun. Hunor and Magyar had ridden off to capture it, leaving old Nimrod behind, for he was too old for a long off capture. He was too old for a long hunt. Since then he had been waiting every day at sunset for the return. Now, as the red sun touched the rim of the mountains, Nimrod turned to the altar and, lifting his arms, sighed in prayer, "O powerful Hadur, have pity on me and my people. They are suffering with hunger. I am suffering with shame, for I have nothing to offer thee. Give me a sign to show me what I can do to appease thy anger." The silence was broken by a soft neighing sound. Something cool and moist touched his arm. Taltos, his horse, faithful friend and companion of many great hunts, had come up to him silently and stood close by now, his whole body trembling. Old Nimrod looked at the beautiful animal for a long time. Slowly, 2 large tears rolled down his cheeks. "So I must make an offering. The greatest sacrifice is wanted by the Hadur." The story is getting good. With tender hands, he patted the trembling animal's neck and turned away quickly and lighted the sacrificial fire on the altar. Smoke billowed and hung sluggishly still in the still altar. When the red flames licked through the small kindling and caught the heavy logs, he led his horse to the altar step. For one long moment, the man and the beast looked at each other. Then, with a great broken sob, old Nimrod grasped his heavy war club and, gathering all his strength, brought it down on the animal's forehead. The horse fell without a sound. Old Nimrod crumbled to his knees. He bent lower and lower. His head touched the ground. For a long time, only the sharp crackling and burning wood broke the silence. Flames rose higher and higher. The crackling was submerged in the increasing roar of the fire. The sound grew, and other sounds mingled with it. Howls of wind, which sprang from nowhere, rushing of water, thundering hoofbeats, screams of horses, cried of men. Old Nimrod staggered to his feet and looked around, with dazed eyes. From the camping ground, his people were running towards him, stumbling, falling, pushed by a terrific gale. Tents were torn from their moorings and carried away. Horses had broken loose. They ran around, wild-eyed and screaming. Sparks and flames of the fire had blown into the grass around the altar and were burning a broad path towards the mountains, a clear-cut path, a highway of leaping, roaring fire towards the west. Now, thunder, frightening, long drawn-out, deafening thunder added to the noise of the turmoil. The ground shook as it reached its climax with a terrible crash. People fell on the ground and lay trembling, too frightened to cry out. Only old Nimrod remained standing, a tall, majestic figure with his arms stretched straight out at the angry sky. So he killed his horse, and a horrible storm has erupted, and all the people are terrified. See the terrified people? But Nimrod is not scared. Speak, O powerful Hadur, speak to thy servant, he cried. Another thunder shook the ground, and a third. After that came silence, so sudden and so deep that it was more terrifying than the storm before. The wind ceased as suddenly as it had come, and the smoke rose once more straight into the air. Only the path of fire crept slowly westward, burning high and bright. Then a new scream, then a new sound, a scream piercing and high rent the silence. It was a scream of an eagle, so shrill, so imperious that everyone looked up in the sky. They saw a great eagle, holy bird of Hudar, circling slowly over the column of smoke. It cried again and hovered for a moment, suspended motionless with its great wings. Then it plunged headlong into the fire. A gasp of horror rose from the old people, but old Nimrod said, "Have no fear, my people. Hudar is speaking. Behold, where one eagle had been before, two more were circling. They flew side by side, their great wings touching, circling 3 times, and flew off, one to the west, one to the north. Another eagle appeared, as if it had taken shape from the smoke, circled around 7 times and disappeared to give the people place to still another, a giant bird greater than all. Its tremendous wings caught the glow of the fire. They seemed red as blood. Its voice rose into a piercing, victorious cry as it soared higher and finally flew straight towards the west. Old Nimrod followed its flight with his eyes until it was no bigger than a speck of dust in the sky. Then he turned to his people and said, "Hadur has spoken. Listen to me, brothers. The first eagle told us that I, your leader, for so many years shall not be with you long. I shall soon leave and go to the land of my fathers. My place shall be taken by two leaders, Hanor and Magyar. They shall lead you to the promised land. But they shall not see it. After they are gone, there shall be another leader, and it shall be his son, greatest of all, with a mighty voice and wings red as blood, who will lead you to the promised land. His power will be so great that the earth will tremble and stars will fall down at his approach. His warriors will be more than the grains of the sand and the blades of grass on the plains. Under the hooves of the horses, the ground will groan, and the air will echo the clanging of countless swords. He shall be called Scourge of Hadur, for nothing can resist his ruthless progress into the land of destiny. The Scourge of Hudar, greatest of all warriors, Attila Hadur has spoken. We will obey. So the final great warrior will be Attila. Hadur has spoken, we will obey, repeated the listeners in a low murmur. Then the clear voice of a child rang out, "But where are Hunor and Magyar? They have been away 7 moons ago." "They are coming back," answered Nimrod. "They are coming now," cried the child, pointing to the west. 2 riders appeared on the crest of the hill and rode swiftly, skirting the path of fire. They rode side by side, their spurred boots touching. Their saddles were laden with game, and their faces proud and happy. "Twin eagles of Hadur," whispered a woman. The crowd stirred in excitement. People repeated the woman's words. First puzzled whispers, then a great joyous shout. "Hunor and Magyar, twin eagles of Hadur, welcome." Hunor and Magyar leaped from the saddles and ran to old Nimrod. He embraced them silently. After a moment, Hunor lifted his head and looked intently into his father's eyes. Okay, this is part 1. I will be back tomorrow with part 2.